Continuing second reading, regular, page 21 of the printed calendar. Next up, House Bill 1432, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia, several sections of the Code of Virginia, relating to carrying a switchblade knife exception. Report for the Committee for Courts of Justice. Mr. Speaker, there also is a floor amendment.
The gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take up the floor amendment first because it is a tightening floor amendment, and it comes. It's not from the Sheriff's Association, but it's to address a concern that they related.
The clerk will report a floor amendment.
Floor amendment offered by Delegate Ware to the introduced version on line 17, after the words profession or, insert the word lawful.
I think, Mr. Speaker, the amendment is self-explanatory, and I would ask for its adoption.
The question is on adoption of the floor amendment offered by the gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Floor amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Powhatan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moving to the underlying legislation, because of its title, I'd like you to kind of step back from the bill itself momentarily and visualize two separate things. The first is this. I want you to visualize a group of people who are collectors, coin collectors, stamp collectors, and they're gathered around their particular object of interest, and they look at its unique properties, its ornamentation, it's what makes it unique and gives it its interest. There is such a group that looks at knives, the Greater Richmond Knife Club, and that's one of several such in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are people who simply have an interest in the curiosity, in the history of the features of various knives, including automatic knives or switchblade knives. And it was from such a group, or an individual from such a group, that this legislation came to me to bring to you. The second thing I'd like you to visualize is the last time you were standing atop a ladder, step ladder, ladder to take the leaves out of your gutter, and how you felt as you were atop that ladder. Every day there are roofers who go up those ladders, and they have to carry things up and open up a packet, and they may have a knife to open that packet up. The second provision of this is to deal with tradesmen who have just those circumstances that you and I deal with. These are ordinary, hardworking men and women who are tradesmen, tradeswomen. And the second element in there is on their behalf. And there is a group called the American Tool and Knife Institute, which is the other interested group that brought this bill to me. It's out of that this bill comes. It comes to you because there are two provisions currently in the Code of Virginia. One makes it illegal to carry these knives concealed. And again, to revert to the roofer, let's say you're up there on that roof, you open the package, you put it in the belt, you forget about it because you're doing other things up on the roof, you're carrying it, you get back in your truck and you head down the road. It happens to be concealed, but it's not an intentional thing. You're not using it as a weapon. You're a tradesperson. The second provision in the Code of Virginia says that possession of this knife is prima facie evidence, that's a direct quote, prima facie evidence of your intent to sell. So these fellows who get together at the Greater Richmond Knife Club, as they drive up the road, they're concerned that they would be considered salesmen of these knives. And this is the concern out of which it came. The word switchblade brings all kinds of connotations to our mind, and I would remind you that words have both their denotative meaning and their connotative meaning. If you can set those separately and realize what we're talking about here, it's a knife that's a tool. It's one that happens to have a blade.
Can I interrupt the gentleman for a minute?
Certainly.
Would the House please come to order? There's just an awful lot of talking going on. The gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We wanted to use the term, a somewhat more neutral term, automatic knife, but that, because the word switchblade occurs in the code a number of times, it would have been a much more complicated bill to put that word in as a substitute for switchblade, so we went with what is here. An automatic knife is one that has a blade which can be unfolded or extended automatically by triggering a latch or a similar mechanism. As I mentioned, the amendment we just adopted was to speak to a concern brought to us by the Sheriff's Association on recreational activity. It now narrows it to lawful recreational activity. I would note that my own sheriff is fully in support of this legislation, so I think there are probably differences thereabout. There has been a concern that this would permit sales to minors. It does not. There is a provision in the Code of Virginia, it's 18.2-309, Section A, which says any person who sells, barters, and so forth to a minor shall be guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. That remains in force and on the books. It's unaffected by this legislation, so that should not be a concern. I will further note that this bill has been supported by, but it did not originate from, Second Amendment support groups. They have indicated they are supportive, several of them, but it's not their bill. It didn't come from them. So finally, I would ask you, as you vote on this measure, to look past the shining but disorienting name, switchblade, and look at the actual purpose and the actual words of the legislation, and join me in helping ordinary folks, hobbyists, and tradesmen by voting on this bill. I hope you will vote to engross and pass it to its third reading.
The gentleman from Arlington, Mr. Lopez.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
Before I begin, I just want to thank the gentleman from Powhatan, who has been incredibly generous with his time and communication and talking about this bill, and open to suggestions and ideas for language. As we all know, a couple years ago, there was legislation that would have had a blanket allowing back into the course of business, blackjacks, swords and canes, throwing stars, and other weapons, sort of back into our streets. It was an en masse, but instead of actually sort of allowing all of these en masse, now there's concern that there are certain folks who are trying to get one weapon at a time. So today it's switchblades. There's going to be other legislation dealing with ballistic knives. There are concerns here also with lines 16, 17, and 18, just overly broad language. The question is, what lawful profession or recreational activity requires a switchblade knife where a fixed blade or manual opening knife wouldn't suffice? Moreover, the testimony during committee from the VCDL clearly stated that these knives would enhance personal defense options, not just work or recreation. And so I appreciate where the gentleman's coming from regarding collectors, but there are unintended consequences. The language in the bill is so broad that I think it covers too many types of knife blades with very different types of utilities. Knives that are designed as thrusting weapons, like dirks or daggers or stiletto blades, should not be legal for sale or carry. The argument that they can be deployed in tight spaces by tradesmen should not apply to blade designs that are simply for thrusting. A roofer, an HVAC installer, doesn't need to stab anything. Switchblades were originally put into the code several times to keep these deadly weapons out of the hands of gangs. And dangerous and deadly weapons like these in the hands of a bad actor are not good for our communities to have around. As it currently stands, for instance, line 16, when you say that section 309 of the code addresses minors, line 16 of the code says any person. In this bill, in this bill says any person. So that includes kids. So there's no limitation on the purchase of these weapons. So a 16-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 7-year-old could take their allowance, and wherever they're selling these switchblades could buy a switchblade. The recreational activity language is also pretty broad. Recreational activity, according to John Jones from the Sheriff's Association, was walking down the street. Why is there no age limitation on the purchase of these weapons? Why do we keep these weapons out of the hands? We're trying to keep these weapons out of the hands of gangs, and how do we keep them out of the hands of kids? Unfortunately, I believe that this legislation creates many more problems than it helps. We are creating a minefield here, folks, and I hope you'll please vote no. Thank you.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? Those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.